In today's new episode of Missing, we complete our Bennington Triangle with the case of Frieda Langer, who went missing on October 28th, 1950 from Bennington, Vermont. Lance, what do you think of this conversation?
Well, I said it during the conversation that it's a little bittersweet because this is the last one that we speak about with Ross Griffiths. And if you're listening to this on the 27th, you know that tomorrow will be the 75th anniversary of Frieda's disappearance. And this one does bring our Bennington Triangle coverage to more of a full circle than I expected because her body was found, but it still is a little bit open-ended, which we have come to expect when we've been talking about these stories from the Bennington Triangle. There has to be some element of mystery that remains.
And our guest today, the wonderful Ross Griffiths, is an archives librarian from Worcester State University, and he joins us once again to discuss this case.
All right, so we're going to break real quick for commercial, and we will return with the story of Frieda Langer as delivered to us by the one and only Ross Griffiths.
Once again, welcome back to the podcast, Ross Griffiths. Ross, how are you today?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you on once again, as Tim said, and it's a little bit bittersweet this time around because this is the last story that you'll be telling us about this amazing area in New England called the Bennington Triangle. You've been on numerous times to talk about this, and I hope you come back on. I hope we find another series, another, story that we can sink our teeth into again in the future. But for anyone who hasn't heard you in the past 22 times you've been on the show, can you just reintroduce yourself and a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I'm Ross Griffiths. I'm the archives librarian at Worcester State University. So I spend a lot of time working with students on history projects, doing research, buying books for the collection, taking care of rare books and special collections. But I have a particular interest in primary sources and folklore and mythology and how we can look at historical materials and learn some things about some of the folklore and the urban legends that we live with today. And the Bennington Triangle is a great example of that.
It sure is, and it refers to an area in Vermont, the town of Bennington, and we've spoke about several of these cases previous to this conversation. But yeah, can you fill us in a little bit on the story that we're going to be hearing about today? Who is Frieda?
Yeah, Frieda Langer is the last of the 5 canonical disappearances associated with the Bennington Triangle. There are other disappearances in the region that have been debated, but these 5 seem to be the ones that are discussed most commonly. And Frieda's the last in the sequence. She's also the only person to have been found. The Frieda Langer case is a solved case, which sets it apart from the rest. But there are still some unanswered questions about what happened to her and how she got lost in the woods that day. And we'll talk more about that as we proceed. Langer, at the time of her disappearance, was 53 years old. She was born Elfriede Matzner in Germany in 1897. She had immigrated to Massachusetts as a teenager to live with some relatives of hers. When she was still fairly young, she married Max Langer. Now, Frieda and Max worked at the old Greylock Mills in North Adams, Massachusetts, which was really the big industrial concern in North Adams at that time. Max was a loom fixer. So when these big commercial looms broke down, he would bring his toolbox out and do repairs on it. They were married relatively young. They had a little boy who died tragically as an infant. They never had any more kids, but they developed a very close family-type relationship with Frieda's cousin, Herbert Elsner, who lived several blocks away. He was quite a bit younger than the Langers, but he was a bit like, get a sense he was kind of like a peer, but maybe a bit of a foster son to them. And Max and Frieda Langer and Herbert Elsner spent a lot of time together. And one of the things they'd enjoy doing was going up to the Langers' cabin on the Somerset Reservoir in Vermont. So this is going to take us about 25 miles north of North Adams, Massachusetts, and about 14 miles east of the long trail where Paula Weldon and Mitty Rivers were last seen, and maybe about 20 miles to the east of where Paul Jepson was last seen. So we talked in the first episode about Glastonbury Mountain. It's that big landmark just east of Bennington. Well, Somerset is on the other side of Glastonbury Mountain from Bennington. It's a particularly isolated area. Somerset's really more of a census-designated place because there really isn't a lot there except for this reservoir. The reservoir was constructed in the 1910s as part of a hydroelectric project. It's about 5 miles north to south, kind of in a regular shape. There's a dam at the southern end. And at the time that Frieda disappeared, the electric company, which owned the reservoir, leased out parcels of land on the shore for people to build little vacation cottages. And the Langers had built a vacation cottage near the dam on the southeastern side of the reservoir. And they spent just about every weekend at this cottage. It was a 45-minute drive from North Adams. It's a rustic cottage, 1 bedroom, sleeping loft, and a fireplace. It was the kind of place that people who are outdoorsy would enjoy spending time. But it's important they've been going there for so many years because it meant that Frieda and Max and Herbert knew the woods around this cabin really well. On October 28th, 1950, now this is just about 3 weeks after Paul Jepson disappeared in Bennington, they leave their home in North Adams to go to the cabin. They arrive early afternoon. Max had an arthritic knee, so he stayed behind at the cabin while Frieda and Herbert went on a hike. And this is a case where, again, geography is going to be really important. So I'm going to try to paint a picture of where they went that day so viewers can maybe kind of try to picture in their minds how this played out. They left the cabin, which was on the shore of the reservoir. They walked in a northerly direction along the shore of the lake, past a couple other cabins where people were staying. And then they walked on a trail in the woods that went in an easterly direction. They followed this trail about a mile up an incline to the top of a ridge. At the top of that ridge, there was a ravine with a creek in the bottom. Herbert crosses the creek. Frieda falls in. It's a shallow creek. She lands in a sitting position in the water. Frieda's wearing a pair of heavy whipcord pants. These are heavy wool pants. They were obviously saturated. So Herbert said later that Frieda kind of laughed it off. She said she slipped on a rock and she felt foolish. She told Herbert she was going to go back and change out of her wet clothes. He should go on ahead. And as she's walking back, she says to Herbert she's going to go off the trail and take a shortcut back to the cabin. So if you remember, they walked north along the lake and then east. So they kind of made a right angle. Frieda was going to walk back in a southwesterly diagonal off the trail. And she was going to go through an area called the Beech Grove. There was a grove of beech trees kind of behind the Langers' cabin, which was a bit of a landmark. So when she got to the Beech Grove, she would know where she was and she'd go to the cabin. Herbert goes on ahead. No one ever sees Frieda again. When he returns to the cabin later that afternoon, Frieda's not there. Max had been there the whole time. Where's Frieda? They checked the bedroom. Frieda's clothes were all still there. There were no wet clothes outside hanging up. They knew she hadn't been back, and they immediately become alarmed. So Max and Herbert spend some time calling her name, walking up and down the lakeshore, talking to some of the neighbors. Nobody's seen her. They assume she's lost in the woods. And if you recall, it's getting late in the afternoon. The sun sets before 6 p.m. this time of year. So this is around 5. They go down to the house occupied by the dam keeper. This is a guy named Mr. Leonard who takes care of the dam, makes sure everything is functioning properly. He's got a phone at his house. They call the police, and the police respond immediately. As we've seen in all these cases, the police did take this seriously from the beginning. This is not a case where the police, didn't take a disappearance with the seriousness they should. They come out after dark. They can't do much searching in the dark. They build bonfires on the shores of the lake to illuminate the woods so they can search in the woods. They bring flashlights. They start searching around the cabin. They talk to Max and Herbert, and Max tells the police something important about Frieda's health. And this detail is often not mentioned in subsequent retellings of Frieda's case. Frieda Langer had a seizure disorder. About 5 years before she disappeared, she had suffered a benign brain tumor and had brain surgery. And after the surgery, she developed a problem with occasional seizures. Now, the seizures she would have were probably what we would call today temporal lobe or absence seizures. So she would suddenly experience she gets spaced out, dizzy, disoriented, and she'd lose consciousness. And when she regained consciousness, she'd be in a confused state. And Max told the police something important. He said he thought that falling in that cold water had triggered one of her seizures. I have never heard of cold temperatures being a trigger. And in fact, it can be a trigger. I looked in the medical literature. And the fact that he mentioned this makes me wonder if this had happened to her before. Had she gotten exposed to cold and suffered a seizure? So what he believed happened was that she'd gotten soaking wet falling into this creek. And on the way back, that cold had triggered a seizure. She lost consciousness. And when she regained consciousness, she would have been disoriented and it would have been dark. So this was the theory they were going with. This woman had a medical emergency that caused her to get lost. The following day, the search takes off in intensity. We have a return appearance of someone from our last episode, which is the sheriff of Cheshire County, New Hampshire, and his tracking dog, Little Queenie. Little Queenie was the dog who tracked Paul Jepson's scent from the Bennington town dump up to that intersection where he disappeared. This time, this dog tracked Frieda's scent down to the creek, between the creek and the cabin, but it never found a secondary scent. Now remember, Frieda had gone she had gone with Herbert up this trail to the creek where she fell in. She said she was taking a shortcut back. There was no secondary scent. There was just the one scent. And they walked that dog around and around the cabin in ever increasing circles, 50 feet, 100 feet. And every time the dog found that one trail, it led between the cabin and the creek, but nowhere else. And this was very puzzling to police. There had been some rain that day. It had been a little foggy. Some people suggested that maybe Frieda had gotten wet and that her wet clothes might have affected the scent, but it doesn't seem like any of those things made sense to police. And I think the police may have become a little suspicious of Herbert and Max's story. Within about a week, Herbert and Max were taken to given polygraph exams. They were taken to Brattleboro first. Polygraph machine didn't work. They had to drive them down to Providence, Rhode Island to do a polygraph. They passed the polygraph. The police talked to the neighbors of the Langers in North Adams. The Langers were a great couple. They got along. They had a social life. There was no evidence of marital discord. And neither one of them changed their story. Herbert remained very stoic. The newspapers commented that he didn't show a lot of emotions. Max was a basket case. He was crying. He was begging people back home to come and help look for Frieda. We have pictures that reporters took of him sitting at the table in his cabin with his head in his hands. So there wasn't any reason to be suspicious of these two men, but obviously the police wanted to cover all their bases. As with all these cases, the search for Frieda was very, very intense. We had military people involved. We had volunteers. You had local sportsmen's clubs. You had Boy Scouts. There were two issues that came up that I think were kind of interesting about that Langer case. The first was that Langer's photo was the first photo ever transmitted over the wire from the town of North Adams. Wire photos have been around for quite a while, but the small town newspapers didn't use them. But hers was the first example of North Adams, Massachusetts, sending out a wire photo. The second issue was that Langer's search was the first one where the National Guard from another state in New England had come in to help with a search. National Guard troops tend to only help during disasters or civil disorder. The governor of Vermont, Governor Arthur, didn't want the Vermont National Guard to help. He thought it was an improper use of the National Guard, but the Vermont authorities got the Massachusetts National Guard to help. So they crossed state lines to help look for Frieda. So this search went on and on for months. There was a search party that got lost. This is how deep these woods are. There was one search party that had been down along the riverbank, farther south of the dam, that had gotten so lost they thought they were going to have to spend the night in the woods. They eventually found their way out to a highway. But I think that's important to pay attention to. You have a group of trained searchers, outdoorsmen, who get lost in these woods. So that tells you the kind of woods we're talking about. And as you saw the rest of these cases, it all happened in the autumn months. The snow comes, The winter comes, there's no more searching to be done. Max and Herbert stay at the cabin for as long as they can. Their friends back home send them care packages of food and clean clothes, but nothing is found. And the search continues in fits and starts all winter long until May 13th, 1951. On May 13th, two fishermen on the east branch of the South Deerfield River. This is the river that was dammed to create the reservoir. So they're about 3 miles south of the dam. Find a body on the riverbank. Body is lying on its back. They know that it's Frieda because she's the only missing person in the area. So they take the long trek out. They contact police, authorities, take a very long trek in, and they observe the following circumstances. So first of all, they know that it's Frieda because Frieda had had a metal plate put in her head after her brain surgery, and that plate was clearly visible. So that tells you the condition her body was in. Frieda's clothing was intact, in perfect condition. Now she was lying in some swampy areas, so she was waterlogged, but she was wearing those brown pants, she was wearing black boots, knee-high black boots, a coat that was buttoned up to the collar. There was no snags or tears indicating that she had thrashed around in the woods or that she had been attacked by somebody. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence of scavenger activity. Remember, she had disappeared way back at the end of October. This is in May. So her body was relatively intact. Near the body was a feature that is described variously as either a water-filled pit or a landlocked pool. Now, what I think they're describing is a feature along the side of the river that when the river floods in the spring after the snow melts, it becomes a channel. And then when the water subsides, that channel becomes a kind of pond, the rest of the year. And adjacent to that, there was a steep embankment with a lot of high weeds. And what police theorized happened was this, that Frieda, for reasons unknown, had been lost in the woods, walking in a southwesterly direction. She overshot the mark past the beech grove, continued going southwest. She came to this embankment in those tall weeds, and she fell over the edge into this pond and drowned. And that her body remained in that body of water all winter long. The area was surrounded by weeds, and so it wasn't really visible. So searchers in the area could have walked right past and not seen her. And then when the snow melted, the water level rose, her body was flushed out of that pool and deposited on the riverbank where the fishermen found her. I'm going to go back to that story before we wrap up because there's a couple of details that are interesting. Her body was collected, was taken to a funeral home for a postmortem exam. We don't have a lot of information as to how thorough the postmortem was based on my limited knowledge of postmortem exams from this era. I'm fairly certain they would have taken off the clothing to examine it for bullet holes or tears from, let's say, a blade or something like that. And whatever tissues remained, they would have examined the body. They might have x-rayed her. There were portable x-ray machines available then because maybe you'd want to look for a bullet or something else. But they didn't find anything. There was no evidence of foul play or any kind of assault. So they determined that it was a death by misadventure, that she drowned. They did hold her body for an extra day. They had told Max they'd send her back on a Tuesday and they held her till a Wednesday. And that suggests to me that they tried to be thorough about this. Max, for his part, was satisfied with the police investigation. He differed with them on one detail. The police thought that Frieda had wandered that entire distance, which is about 3 miles from where she was last seen, that she'd wandered that distance that one day she disappeared and that she drowned that same day. Max didn't think that was possible. He thought that she couldn't have traveled 3 miles through uncharted woods in one day. He thought she might have spent the night in the woods and then proceeded out the next morning and then fallen in and drowned. But he was satisfied with their explanation. He was satisfied with the investigation. And with that, the Langer case was closed. But this was the time when the newspapers began talking about these strange disappearances in the woods. And back in November, before they found her, this is when they invoked the term the lost horizon, the idea that people are wandering away from places where they're supposed to be, and there's something spooky going on in the woods. I think the story of Frieda's death is an interesting one because it is very precise. It's almost a little on the nose. I mean, she had to be walking in a specific place and to fall in a specific area and to land in a specific body of water and then be deposited in a specific place where she'd be found. But part of what I think the police were trying to do was to explain not just what happened to her, but why they failed to find her. Because there were searchers in the general area where her body was found. In fact, it wasn't far from that area where those searchers had gotten lost. So I think they were trying to explain themselves to an increasingly anxious public. Remember, the Vermont State Police had been founded partly because of Paula Weldon's disappearance. They never found her either. So there was a lot going on politically at this point, but it does seem like the police investigation was very, very thorough, and as thorough as it could be in that era. And the people closest to Frieda felt satisfied with the explanation the police came up with. And that's the story of Frieda Langer. I find it a little unsatisfying, but and I don't know why exactly. It seems a little clean to me, and yet there's really no reason to think something other than that happened. And so I'm interested in hearing what you guys have to think about all that.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
I got a quick question, just to confirm. Was this about 2 weeks after the Jepson disappearance?
Yeah, about 2 to 3 weeks. Jepson, I don't recall the exact date, but he disappeared, I think, around October 11th. So it would have been maybe 2 to 3 weeks after his disappearance. And it was really at the time the Jepson search was winding down. That was really the time the parents were kind of giving up. And when they were giving up over in Bennington, on the other side of Glastonbury Mountain, Frieda was walking off into her doom, as it were.
So how did the media, or how did the perception sort of play out in the public with that one just coming off the heels, with Langer coming off the heels of Jepson? Were people, you said that that's when they started to come up with the idea of this lost horizon, but were people thinking that this was actually connected? And then when did they start bringing in the other names from previous years?
It wasn't clear that they were necessarily connected from, let's say, a forensics perspective, because it was quite a distance away. But I think once the Bennington papers got word of the Langer disappearance, because the Langer disappearance was covered mostly in the North Adams papers. Those are the resources to go to find all the details. I think once the newspapers started talking to each other, they realized they had this pattern. And I think the fact that the Jepson and Langer disappearances overlapped really emphasized the sense that there was something weird happening with these disappearances. It was around November that the other cases were brought in. The Tedford case seems to be a bit of a latecomer to the Bennington Triangle cases. That wasn't part of the discussion until after the Langer case was resolved, at least as far as what I've been able to tell. But they did talk about Paula Weldon, and they talked about Mitty Rivers, who kind of set the whole thing off. And in fact, in many ways, I think the Langer case the Langer case and the Rivers case kind of bookend this, because both of them are outdoorsy people, skilled outdoors people who disappeared in woods that they kind of knew. And yet when you drill down into the details, each of them was off the trail in an area they might not have been familiar with. So it's not quite as mysterious as it seems at first. But I think they're very similar cases in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think you're right. So was it confirmed that Frieda had that seizure that caused her to, I guess, collapse, or we're just going with the police's theory that that's what happened?
That was mostly Max's speculation.
Okay.
I think the police considered that a possibility, but I get the feeling that the police weren't concerned about the whys. They just knew she had gotten lost. And that may be because people who are experienced outdoors people know that people get lost in the woods. You get lost in woods you're familiar with. So I don't think the police were as worried about why Frieda went off the trail and got lost, but Max was convinced it was the seizure that did it.
Herbert, how old was Herbert?
Herbert was probably, from what I gathered, in his late 30s. So he was probably not quite a generation younger than the Langers. He was a grown adult. So he would potentially have been the age their son had been had he lived. But he was, like I said, he was kind of in between being a peer and being maybe a bit of a child or a child figure to them.
And did any searches intensify, or were there any renewed searches for the other disappearances in bodies of water based on Langer?
I have not seen any evidence that the Langer case influenced any further actions on the other cases. The other cases were all in some way or another proceeding at their own pace. Paula Weldon's father never gave up looking. Mitty Rivers' friends, I think, were always kind of keeping their eyes open for him when they were out in those woods. But I think that the official investigations don't seem to have been influenced by this, and yet we all know that police talk about things behind the scenes they don't talk about to the media, even though they were much more frank with the media in these days than they are today. But nothing apparent. It doesn't seem like this disappearance necessarily informed a lot about future investigation for these other victims.
Right. It is kind of wild, in a sense, to be talking about Frieda Langer's disappearance about 75 years later, when we just kind of all agreed that her disappearance seems, accidental and don't want to say typical, but I mean, it's kind of in the woods and, it does happen naturally. So I guess my question is, how did we get to this point? How did the legend of the Bennington Triangle begin?
I think it began while Langer was still missing. Because if we think about it, back in November, here's another person who's disappeared. And the newspapers, I think, created in some sense a link between these 5 people as all of these missing people in the woods around Vermont. And that was really the genesis of this. Had Frieda been found right away, it's hard to say whether she would have been lumped in with this other group or not, because it wouldn't have been until May that she was found. So it had that whole winter to kind of percolate. And I think that people subsequent to her disappearance have linked these stories, these people together in the same way the newspapers did. And if we recall from the Mitty Rivers case, there were articles in, I think it was Fate magazine, as early as the mid-1950s, linking these cases together as the newspapers did back in 1950. So I really think it was that initial news coverage that linked these cases together. There is no, to my knowledge, as far as I can tell, forensic link between these cases. There's no apparent personal link between these people. They all didn't seem to know each other. Each of these cases seems to have its own kind of unique spin to it. So I think it simply is proximity and time that holds all of these people together.
You mentioned earlier on that this area was part of a hydroelectro project. Can you just go into that a little bit more? What was the purpose of that?
Essentially, the dam was built to control the water flow to hydroelectric generators downstream. So essentially, you want to keep a steady flow of water when you have a hydroelectric plant. The water goes through a turbine, it spins the turbine, generates electricity. But in order to make sure that electricity supply is steady, you need a steady flow of water. And so you create a dam which allows you to release water or hold water back as you need to keep that water flowing steadily. The hydroelectric stations are considerably farther downriver than this particular dam. In fact, I'm not even sure where they were located. They referred to it broadly as sort of the Deerfield River Hydroelectric Project. So it sounds like there were multiple hydroelectric stations down farther on the Deerfield River. So this was essentially the topmost method of controlling the water flow to generate power. And of course, if you look at a map, you have nearby towns and cities like Pittsfield and Springfield. I'm not sure how far south or north the power would have gone, but this would have been a project generated in the early days of electricity, anticipating the growth of towns and cities. And this was a heavily industrial area as well. So a lot of the industries farther down the Deerfield River would be relying on this electricity too. Now, those cabins are long since gone. The area around that lake is now part of the Green Mountain. Don't quote me on this. It's part of a national forest. And all of those cabins have long since been removed. So if you go out there today, you won't find the Langer's cabin. It's all protected land now. But for a period of time, at the time Frieda disappeared, there were, I think, 10 to 12 cabins kind of clustered around the dam. And it was just a popular weekend vacation spot. And similar to Glastonbury Mountain, this area had been involved in the logging industry. So there were old logging trails in the woods. There was an old stagecoach road near the town of Dover that was popular for hikers. So it really was an area that had a lot of attractions for people interested in the outdoors.
And so this might be a really dumb follow-up question to that. Does this hydroelectro station, when it's regulating the water, would you say that it had anything to do with how she drowned or how any of the other victims might have disappeared?
I don't think we have any reason to think that, no. What I think happened to Frieda, based on the maps I've looked at, and this is what some people speculated, was that for reasons unknown, whether it was because she had a seizure or because she had just gotten lost in the woods, was off the trail, that she walked in a southwesterly direction because she knew if she walked that direction far enough, she would get to the river. And when she got to the river, she could then follow it upriver to the dam, and the dam was near where the cabin was. So she was probably following the setting sun. Now, a number of sources said that very thing. If you look at the weather report from that day, however, it was overcast. It was a gray, overcast day, relatively cool, and there was rain that night. So she might not have been able to follow the setting sun. But I think she was intentionally walking there because she knew she would be able to use a waterway to find her way home. Unfortunately, she gets to the waterway, and the waterway is what ends up killing her. So, but I think that's what happened. And there doesn't seem to be any other outside influences that I would be able to point to as a reason for that, other than someone got lost in the woods. Now, it wouldn't be the Bennington Triangle unless there was something weird, right? So here's the weird part of the Langer story. Remember those fishermen that found Langer? Well, one of those fishermen's name was Renton, and he was known to police because back in November, he and his friends had been out in that area when Frieda disappeared, and they were one of the outdoorsmen who were interviewed by police. Have you seen this woman? No, we haven't seen her. But he was known for something else. The Massachusetts State Police recognized his name because about 7 years earlier, while Mr. Renton was out on a fishing trip with another friend on a boat on a creek in Savoy, Massachusetts, which is just east of North Adams, he found another dead body. And this was the dead body of a man who had disappeared from the Boston area. They don't know what he was doing out there. There's not a lot of information about the case. But interestingly enough, according to the original newspaper articles about this man's body, his body was found adjacent to a pool of water where it had been flushed out by a recent rainstorm. And our friend, Mr. Renton, the fisherman, happened to find that body. 7 years later, in another isolated place in the middle of nowhere in New England, he comes upon a pool of water where another body has been flushed out and deposited. Isn't that strange?
Yes.
Yes.
Now,
very strange.
Before we get excited and go to any rabbit holes, there's nothing about Renton that should raise anybody's suspicions. I've looked into his name in newspapers. I looked him up on Ancestry. There's no evidence he had any connections to Langer, and the missing man they found wasn't even from the area. But what are the odds of some guy going out and fishing, finding two dead bodies in the middle of nowhere?
Yeah,
It's
it's a great question. I think if you're out there every day or a lot of days, the odds certainly go up that you're going to find something like that more than once. But that is wild. Now, was he investigated at all?
I would presume he would have been. This was published in the papers. There's a whole section of the paper about Renton's it's not new to finding dead bodies. I'm sure they would have, and it doesn't sound like they found anything, but it's just one of those things. Like each one of these cases has a thing that was really weird. And it got me thinking about the odds of things happening. Part of why we cluster these disappearances together in the Bennington Triangle is we ask ourselves, what are the odds that 5 unrelated people could disappear in one area in unrelated incidents without there being some bigger connection to it all? Well, how mysterious you think that is depends on how you weigh those odds. If you talk to, as I mentioned in the Rivers case, if you talk to a national park ranger, talk to experienced hikers, they will tell you, stay on the trails. Experienced hikers are the ones carrying trail maps with them. The people who are most able to handle themselves outdoors are often the most careful because they know the odds of that. But if you don't think about those odds and you just step back, it does seem a lot more mysterious. So I'm not convinced that there is any bigger meaning behind these disappearances other than how we calculate the odds. But if you drill down in these primary sources, in these newspaper articles, in the Weldon case, the case files, there is something weird about each one of these. There's some weird coincidence or some weird name that keeps popping up. So there's still plenty of weirdness. But I just thought that was extraordinary when I read that, and I thought that would how would that make you feel about fishing? Would this guy ever go fishing again after that? I mean, it's just too freaky.
I mean, maybe after you find the first one, you're sort of, if you decide to continue fishing, you're probably kind of keeping your eyes peeled for another one, because it's always going to be on your mind when you go into an unknown area and you're just kind of looking where you're walking, right?
I guess so. He did say something interesting to police. He said that the reason they were down where Frieda was found is because the fishing wasn't any good where they intended to be that day. They were supposed to be farther up creek, and it just wasn't, they weren't getting what they wanted. So they ended up, just because of that, going to this area and just happening to find her. And I think it's pretty remarkable. If there had been a heavy rainstorm or a thunderstorm, it's very likely her body would have been washed completely down the river and never found. So it does seem like there's a certain serendipity to having her found. It would have been very, very likely that she could never have been discovered. So there is an element of chance to this that I think is interesting. But again, we don't have evidence that's anything other than just coincidence. So.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Can you tell us a little bit more about that Boston man? Why isn't that case part of the Bennington Triangle?
Well, it's a little farther outside. It's down in Savoy, Massachusetts, and there's not a lot of information about him. He was originally from Texas, and he worked for the railroad. The articles from when his body was found stated they didn't know why he was in that section of woods. They didn't find any evidence of foul play, but foul play just means a criminal act. It could have been a suicide. He could have been a hunter. He could have been lost in the woods. There's not much information about him. One source states he lived in Johnstown, New York. I think he lived in Boston. I found more sources saying he lived in Boston. So he's this Boston guy out in the Berkshires. It's a popular place for Boston people to go hunting, to enjoy nature. Something happened. He ends up dead in a pool of water, and he's found. Now, he was found in the summer months. He had been in that area for a couple of weeks, deceased. But there's nothing. It's kind of a dead end, and I would argue that there probably aren't any case files existing about that either, because it's been, more than 80 years. But no, it's kind of a dead end story, and not much was made of it after the Langer case was resolved. It was just one of those, what an interesting coincidence that this guy was found deceased in Massachusetts 7 years earlier. I did find it interesting. I found little tidbits about him in Texas. He was from San Antonio, and his family was involved. There's a big carnival down in San Antonio, and his family was involved in some of the carnival activities down there. But there really isn't much else about him besides that.
Well, I just looked it up, and Savoy isn't as far as I thought it was from Bennington, unless I'm reading the map wrong. It's less than an hour by car today, so probably over an hour back then. Like 100-something miles?
We could move that bottom line of the triangle down.
Bump it down a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, Bennington's only, the Somerset Lake is only about 25 miles north of North Adams. So I think from Bennington, it's like an hour's drive probably. But yeah, and it makes me wonder how many there might be other cases like this that weren't lumped together back in 1950 by the newspapers. Remember, the newspapers had to work with their sort of local coverage. The people in Bennington newspaper weren't necessarily talking to North Adams or people in Brattleboro. So there might be other cases of people found deceased or dead in this area that just aren't put together in this particular set of disappearances. But it is interesting. That guy's an interesting character, and I'm curious. There's obviously a story about why he was there, but we don't know what that story is. I haven't been able to find any records beyond what was published in the newspapers about it.
Yeah, I am wondering, because this is 75 years since the Bennington Triangle cases sort of wrapped up. I am wondering, could we do that with other cases? And I guess my follow-up is, Is this group of disappearances a rarity, or is there just not enough imagination in the 75 years since to do this with other ones?
I would argue for the geographical area we're talking about, I think this cluster of unresolved disappearances is a rarity. I couldn't find examples. There's obviously examples of missing people, but this sort of group of people, all from different walks of life. If you look at the Vermont State Police website, they have a missing persons tab. There are a number of missing persons cases, including Paula Weldon, on that tab, but most of them are, hunter. One of them was a hunter disappears. A couple of them are clearly cases that seem like they're self-harm. Somebody was threatening suicide. Their car was found parked outside a state park area. They were not found. But those are tragedies. They don't strike me as mysteries necessarily. Whereas these cases are mysteries because there isn't a clear answer. There isn't a situation where you had an abusive spouse who was a suspect or a person of interest, or where you had a person out of motive to run away. Some of the really old cases I looked at, there was a guy who disappeared, but he had stolen a lot of money from a charity picnic. Okay, so there's an answer. None of these have that obvious answer. And I think just the idea, they walked off in the woods and were never found again. People do disappear in the woods, but these were really intensive searches. I mean, these searches were hundreds of people over weeks and weeks and weeks scouring those woods. And yes, you can still not find a body, but it does seem unlikely. So I think it's a statistical anomaly, and I do think it's unusual. And I think that the people in 1950 were correct in saying this is weird and we got to get to the bottom of this.
And can you explore with us just a little bit this lost horizon theory, this concept?
Yeah, well, the Lost Horizon was a reference to a popular fiction book. I haven't read the book. I think I probably read it many, many years ago. But the broad story is it's fiction. A bunch of people become stranded in the mountains in Tibet. They are drawn to this particular place. It's a Buddhist monastery called Shangri-La. And there's a lot of mystical elements to it, lost time, destiny, fate, those kinds of things. But it was a popular novel. It became a popular movie. So that is what people were invoking when they talked about these missing people, that there was something about the woods, the mountains, the Glastonbury Mountain, that was perhaps drawing people away from the places they were supposed to be. The police shot this stuff down, by the way. The police had no interest in talking about mysteries or conspiracies. They said people get lost in the woods all the time. But I think that the media was interested in this. They were interested in this spooky sense that people had, that there was something wrong in this area of Vermont. And, I was just talking about this with some friends of mine over the summer. And a friend of mine who's a New Englander says she knows people who don't like driving through Bennington because of this. There are people who find the area kind of eerie, and they'll take an alternate route to go around it. So it's definitely something that has stuck in the public imagination. Regardless of whether we can explain away these disappearances or not, I think it gives people an eerie feeling.
So when are we going?
Well, that's a good question. It's interesting. Mitty Rivers disappeared. Oh gosh, I don't have my notes in front of me, but it was right at the end of October, beginning of November of 1945. So the 80th anniversary is coming up. Frieda disappeared 75. So these anniversaries are lining up, and all of this did happen this time of year. It was going into mid-autumn, late autumn. And so if you're interested in getting a feel of what this place is like, now is the time of year to go up. In fact, if you wait until the leaves fall, you won't have as much traffic. Leaf peepers love going to this part of Vermont to catch the fall colors. But by the end of October, beginning of November, those colors have faded, and the beds and breakfasts are emptying out. And I think there's less traffic. So if you want to get a sense of what this is like, this is the time of year to go see it. It's beautiful up there. I love the hills up there. Bennington is a beautiful town. It's got this sort of quaint downtown. It's got a beautiful historic district. There's just a lot of cool stuff to see up there. I don't feel scared of the area. I think it's a beautiful area, and I understand why people are drawn to those woods. And tens of thousands of people have camped and hiked in those woods over the years and come back just fine. So I don't think there's any dangers facing anybody who decides to pay a visit.
Well, I sure hope it feels scary.
It's a good time of year to be scared. So, maybe it would be a Halloween trip for some people who enjoy the outdoors.
Yeah. My final question about Frieda's case, Ross, is how come she wasn't found by the search?
I think that the explanation the police gave was twofold, that she was probably submerged in water, which means they might have walked right past where she was. The second was that the area where she was had a lot of tall weeds and brambles. So this pool they talked about, as well as the embankment, was not very visible. And if we think about it, she's wearing heavy wool clothing. The water would have been really cold. And again, as I've said throughout this series, I'm not a forensics expert, but if you read just the basic forensics literature, when a person drowns in ice cold water, their body is more likely to sink and stay below the surface for longer because the process of decay that causes the body to become buoyant is slowed down. So there's a good possibility that searchers were in this area. Now, retellings of the story really emphasize the area had been searched and she wasn't there, then she was. That's not exactly what happened. The area was lightly searched. It means that that really intensive search where you have guys 3 feet apart walking in a straight line, that wasn't happening down along the riverbank. There were isolated groups of people poking around with sticks, looking under logs, but it wasn't a really intensive search. So they were satisfied with the idea that A, she was invisible under the water, and B, that area might not have had searchers in it. Searchers might have not come within 100 yards of that area. So it was a lightly searched area. It doesn't seem like a particularly puzzling mystery. But again, it had to happen exactly the way the police described it for that to be the case. I also think it's notable that, and again, not a forensics expert, but if she had lain out along the riverbank since October, I find it hard to believe her body wouldn't have been taken apart by scavengers. Her clothing, there were no marks of gnawing marks or anything like that. And I just, if somebody's buried under snow or earth, even shallowly, scavengers won't touch a body. But a body out in the open like that would have been a target for these little animals. And it doesn't sound like that really happened. So I think the police investigation does make sense considering the context of where the body was found and how. And I want to emphasize, when people retell the story and say she was discovered in an area that had been searched, that's not exactly accurate. She was in an area that may have been lightly searched. But remember, this was many miles from the campsite. They weren't looking for her that far away.
And just my final question, did her husband Max remarry?
Not to my knowledge. He went on to live until 1967, and he's buried with her in North Adams now, but I can't find evidence that he remarried. It's funny, when I read through these stories, the people I kept picturing with Max and Frieda were the neighbors from the old I Love Lucy show. Do you remember? What were their names again? It was Fred and Ethel. The Langers were fun people. They were active in their community. They did stuff together. It sounds like they enjoyed each other's company. And so that's what made this story so sad. Max, the pictures of Max sitting at the table, just, with his head in his hands, where's my Frieda? Bring her home. It's a really, really sad story. But they were by all accounts, a very happy, active, engaged couple. And he may have, like a lot of people who have a marriage like that, they may discover that they don't want to try to replace the person who was perfect for them. So,
well, I don't want to replace you for these episodes.
That's much appreciated. Thanks. Well, we got some more stuff to talk about down the road. So this won't be the last time we sit down and meet like this.
Sounds great. Well, Ross, thank you so much for spending some time with us here today and exploring these disappearances with us. It's really fascinating, and I hope everyone is as interested in these mysteries as we are.
I appreciate you giving me the opportunity. This was fun for me too. Thanks a lot.